This week on the Esther Krakue Show.
How do they go from setting terms to reacting to terms set elsewhere? They confuse being famous with being important, and they confuse being respected with being needed. Now that's not what equal power looks like. That's what hierarchy looks like. And that's the real subject here. Britain wasn't an architect of the main operation. It wasn't the central decider. Can they still act without asking permission? Can they still absorb costs without wobbling? And once that happens, the only question left is how long it takes them to admit it. If you want to understand how countries lose influence, stop listening to how they talk about themselves. Declining powers nearly always sound more impressive than they actually are. They keep the old language and the old posture. They keep acting as if the world still owes them a certain rank. And then they assume that because they were once central, they're still indispensable. They confuse being famous with being important, and they confuse being respected with being needed. In the end, they very often realize the truth far later than everyone else does. Influence is much simpler than prestige and much harsher. A country has influence when it can shape events beyond its own borders, when it can make other states stop and think, when it can offer something so valuable or impose costs so painful that nobody serious can just brush it off. That can be military force, it can be economic scale, it can be energy, finance, shipping, technology, intelligence, geography, or some combination of all of them. But it has to be real, and it has to change other people's calculations. If it doesn't, then what the country has is not influence, it's branding. A lot of people misunderstand this because they still think influence is something fluffy. They imagine it's about whether a country has a nice reputation or a famous flag or a clever diplomatic service or a seat at some conference. Those things can help, but they're not a thing in and of itself. A country can still be invited, still be admired, still be spoken of in reverent terms, and still be losing real weight. In fact, that's often the symbol of how decline looks at first. The status symbols survive longer than the substance. The rituals survive longer than the leverage. And the old grandeur hangs around for years, sometimes decades, after the ability to shape the world has started to slip. And this is why the events of early 2026 matter. While the headlines may have moved on, the point still stands. The United States and Israel carried out a strike that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Britain was not part of that strike. Britain's role then emerged in a narrower and more revealing form. Keir Starmer said the US could use British bases for limited defensive strikes against Iranian missile infrastructure, and Britain confirmed that its own fighter jets were involved in defensive operations. The EU called for restraint and respect for international law, while Reuters reported that diplomats privately admitted Europe had little influence over the course of events. Australia said it hadn't participated and did not expect to join in future operations. Now that's not what equal power looks like. That's what hierarchy looks like. And that's the real subject here. Not just Britain, not just Europe, not 1 week's crisis or the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan. The question is older and much more interesting than that. How do countries lose influence at all? How do they go from setting terms to reacting to terms set elsewhere? How do they become powers that still show up, still speak, still sign the communiqué, but no longer have the weight to make the room bend around them? History gives the same answer again and again. Countries lose influence when the foundations of power weaken and the political class keeps pretending nothing much has changed. Sometimes it's debt, or stagnation, or military overreach, or administrative decay. Sometimes it's dependent on a bigger ally. And sometimes the country may still look formidable from a distance, but the system underneath is already tiring, hollowing out, or quietly falling behind. Most declines aren't mysterious, they're cumulative. Let's take Spain, for example. Imperial Spain is a good place to start because it shows how a country can look overwhelmingly powerful while already planting the seeds of its own decline. In the 16th century, Spain looked like the dominant power in Europe. It controlled a sprawling empire, it had silver pouring in from the Americas, it had elite armies, dynastic reach, and the prestige of a monarchy that genuinely believed it had a providential role in Europe. If you'd looked at Spain from the outside, you might have assumed that this is what permanent power looked like. But treasure can flatter a state into bad habits. Spain's silver wealth gave it the appearance of inexhaustibility, and that is a dangerous illusion. States that think new money will keep arriving often become worse at building productive strength at home. They become used to plugging holes with extraction instead of fixing the structure. The history of Habsburg Spain shows repeated debt moratoria, monetary instability, and the crushing fiscal burden of war. Under Philip IV, as military costs mounted, the government resumed debasing the coinage, declared yet another moratorium on debt in 1627, and helped trigger recession through a chaotic reversal. That's not the story of a poor state. It's the story of a state whose power is becoming expensive, clumsy, and increasingly unsustainable. And Spain kept fighting. That is the other part of the story. Great powers don't usually decline by sitting quietly at home. They decline because they keep trying to preserve an old position at a rising cost. Spain fought in the Netherlands, fought France, fought England, defended dynastic interests across Europe, and tied itself to a vision of continental supremacy that demanded endless spending. So you have this strange contradiction. An empire that still looked grand, still carried prestige, still inspired fear, but was becoming financially brittle and strategically overstretched. It was spending the future to preserve the appearance of the present. And that's one of the classic ways countries lose influence. They mortgage tomorrow to pretend yesterday is still alive. And notice how decline worked here. Spain didn't wake up one morning and become irrelevant. It remained a major power for a long time. It still had territory, status, and military capacity, but it was becoming less efficient and less adapted than its rivals and less able to convert its resources into lasting strategic advantage. That is the part people miss. Decline is not always about an absolute collapse. Sometimes it's about relative erosion. Your rivals organize themselves better. They build more resilient fiscal systems. They innovate faster. They sustain naval power more efficiently. They turn commerce into influence more effectively. And one day you find that you're still famous, still ceremonially important, and no longer quite the country everybody fears most. Then there's the Ottoman Empire, which is useful for a different reason. The Ottomans showed that decline is often not dramatic at all. It can be slow, administrative, almost boring in places, until suddenly the world has reclassified you. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached an extraordinary height. It had one of the most formidable militaries in the world, controlled vast territories, sat astride major trade routes, and projected the confidence of an empire that expected to expand. Then, after that zenith, the long weakening began. Britannica describes the period after 1566 as a slow deterioration marked by inflation, social unrest, weakened central authority, corruption, military defeats, and a failure to adapt quickly enough to changing conditions. What makes the Ottoman case so interesting is that it was not just one big war or one bad ruler. It was a broad failure of adjustment. The empire was hit by inflation partly because of the influx of precious metals into Europe from the Americas, which disrupted its economy. Revenues weakened and the treasury lost grip. The state resorted to debasing the coinage, increasing taxes, and confiscating wealth, all of which deepened the trouble. At the same time, the military system that once made the Ottomans so feared was becoming harder to maintain. The famous Janissaries, who had once been a terrifyingly effective force, became more politically entrenched and less reliable as an instrument of reform. Local notables gained more autonomy. Central power weakened. Reform became harder because too many vested interests were now tied to the old arrangements. That's the hugely important point. Countries often lose influence because the people benefiting from the old system become the strongest obstacle to renewing it. You see this again and again in history. The empire knows something is wrong. Parts of the elite even know reform is needed. But the institutions that would have to be changed are full of people whose status depends on nothing changing too quickly or at all. So decline becomes self-protecting. Weakness generates caution. Caution protects the interest causing the weakness. The empire ends up trapped inside its own habits. Meanwhile, outside rivals don't sit still. Europe was changing fast. Trade patterns were changing. War was changing. The administration was changing. The Ottomans were no longer competing against the world they had once mastered. They were competing against a new world while still carrying older assumptions. That is a good recipe for being overtaken. And again, the shift in how others view the empire matters here. The Ottoman Empire did not become meaningless overnight. It still mattered enormously. But gradually, it ceased to be treated as an ascending force and was increasingly treated as a question, a problem, and a patient. By the 19th century, the phrase the sixth man of Europe captured that change in status. Once other powers stop seeing you as an actor that sets the pace and start seeing you as an object to be managed, partitioned, propped up, or negotiated over, your influence is leaking away even if you still possess size and history. That change in category is often the real turning point. Then you come to Britain and Suez, which is one of the clearest examples of influence being lost in public. Suez matters because it forced Britain to confront something it had been avoiding for years. Britain had come out of the Second World War exhausted, financially vulnerable, and steadily losing the easy imperial leverage it once took for granted. The United States had emerged as the dominant Western power. Britain still had prestige, it still had global habits of command, and it still had the reflexes of a country used to giving orders. The problem was that the room it had to maneuver was already much smaller than the performance suggested. When NASA nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, Britain and France didn't read it as a technical dispute. They read it as a direct challenge to rank. The canal mattered materially, but this was really about whether Britain could still impose outcomes in a region where it was once used to being obeyed. So they tried. The military part was never the core problem. The political part was. The crucial actor wasn't Egypt, it was the United States. Eisenhower opposed the operation and applied pressure that Britain couldn't shrug off. Britain was already vulnerable on sterling. The financial and diplomatic squeeze worked. Britain backed down. And that was the point of exposure. It proved that Britain could still move, but it could no longer sustain major action if Washington decided to choke it off. And history is blunt about the outcome. Britannica and France lost most of their influence in the Middle East after Suez. The US State Department's own historical summary talks about humiliation. That language matters because it captures what Suez really was. It wasn't merely a botched episode. It was the moment the hierarchy became undeniable. And here's the bit people often miss. Britain didn't become unimportant after Suez. It stayed a serious country. It kept nuclear weapons. It kept alliance valuable. It kept diplomatic reach. What it lost was something more specific. It lost the ability to act as if it set the regional order on its own terms. That's why Suez still matters today. It's the difference between being influential and being useful. You can be very useful and still not be decisive. And you can see the same basic structure in modern form in the Iran crisis that kicked off this whole conversation. Britain wasn't an architect of the main operation. It wasn't the central decider. It ended up playing the role it often plays now when the United States moves quickly. Defensive operation, base access, managing consequences, trying to stay close enough to matter while keeping enough distance to protect its own position. Keir Starmer said the US could use British bases for limited defensive strikes, and Britain confirmed its own fighter jets were involved in defensive operations. Now that's not nothing, it's meaningful, but it's also not authorship. It's a supportive role inside somebody else's initiative. That is the British arc in one sentence. The symbols remained, but the capacity to set terms narrowed. The Soviet Union shows a different path to decline, and it's worth lingering here because it's one of the most counterintuitive. The Soviet Union didn't look like a declining power in the way people usually imagine decline. It had military prestige, it had ideology, it had a nuclear arsenal capable of destroying the world. It had satellites, proxies, global reach, and a political class that spoke in the language of historical inevitability. If you'd measured power only by military spectacle, you might have thought the Soviet Union was secure for generations. And yet the rot was already there. Britannica's account of the Brezhnev era says the USSR reached the zenith of its international power and prestige in the first half of Brezhnev's incumbency, with détente accompanied by US recognition of nuclear parity. Then it all went wrong. Economic slowdown coincided with increased defense spending and the other disastrous decision to intervene in Afghanistan. Another historical factor on Soviet economic policy describes the late Soviet stagnation as the result of exhausted resources and structural imbalance. In other words, the Soviet Union still looked formidable, but the system underneath the prestige was getting tired, rigid, and less capable of renewal. That is one of the great lessons of power. Military prestige can disguise decay, but it can't solve it. The Soviet economy could no longer produce the dynamism, innovation, and living standard improvements needed to sustain legitimacy and competition over the long term. Defense spending remained high. The war in Afghanistan became a drain and a humiliation. Bureaucracy thickened. Information control weakened. The state still had coercive muscle, but it was increasingly spending energy maintaining an image of strength rather than renewing the substance of it. And once the aura cracked, it cracked fast. A system that had looked immense and terrifying could not manage reform without destabilizing itself, and it could not avoid reform without falling further behind. That's an example of a dangerous position for a great power to be in. What makes the Soviet case so useful for this argument is that it reminds people that countries don't lose influence only through military defeat. Sometimes they lose it because the economy underneath the military can no longer support the burden. And sometimes they lose it because fear was doing too much of the work. And once that fear weakens, there's not enough healthy strength underneath to replace it. Chernobyl belongs in the story as well. It wasn't just a nuclear disaster. It was a moral and political exposure. The Soviet system responded in the most Soviet way possible, with secrecy, denial, and bureaucratic cowardice. Even as radiation spread, the instinct was to cover up, minimize, and control the story. That told the world something important, but it told Soviet citizens something even more important. This was a state so addicted to secrecy and so terrified of admitting weakness that it would rather poison trust than tell the truth. Chernobyl didn't create Soviet decline, but it ripped the mask off. It showed that beneath the military spectacle and the posture of strength was a system that was brittle, dishonest, and decaying. The Soviet Union was feared until it broke, and Chernobyl helped explain why it broke. Now look at Europe today. The European Union is not poor, not backward, and not irrelevant in every domain. It is a huge market. It has enormous regulatory power. It can shape standards and rules that companies around the world have to comply with. In trade, law, and bureaucracy, Europe can still be formidable. But that's not the same thing as being able to shape a hard security crisis at speed. And that's the gap that keeps getting exposed. What the last few years have shown again and again is that Europe has much of the language of strategic seriousness without always having the military depth, political coherence, or appetite for risk that strategic seriousness requires. When the hardest questions arrive, Europe is often rich, affected, concerned, and still waiting for the United States to decide how much of the burden it will carry. Reuters has reported both that Europe had little influence on the current Iran crisis and that European leaders are openly discussing the need to rely less on US defense. It's also reported defense industry warnings that overlapping structures and unclear priorities are wasting time and money. And that's a very recognizable modern form of weakness. A wealthy political entity that knows dependence is dangerous, talks about reducing it, and still struggles to act quickly enough to change the reality. And I think viewers instinctively understand this. Europe is not weak in the cartoon sense. It has money, people, institutions, and technology. What it often lacks is concentrated strategic will. It lacks the kind of unity that turns resources into fast, coherent action. It lacks, in too many moments, the willingness to accept costs, friction, and risk in the name of power. So it produces statements, processes, and frameworks where a harder geopolitical actor would produce decisions. That sounds harsh, but the evidence keeps piling up. On the hardest questions, Europe is often more eloquent than consequential. This brings us to something else that matters a great deal. Countries losing influence when their elites start mistaking language for leverage. They start talking in slogans. They launch strategies unsupported by money, industrial base, or political will. They behave as though the right phrasing can close the gap between shrinking capacity and shrinking influence. But it can't. It spent years talking about sovereignty and strategic autonomy, yet Reuters is still reporting defense industry complaints about overlapping projects, slow decisions, and wasted money, while European leaders openly admit they need to rely less on the United States because the dependency is still baked in. Germany talks about rearmament, but Reuters has reported missing military targets, procurement problems, and delays from suppliers. That's what decline by euphemism looks like. The rhetoric races ahead, but the machinery still lumbers behind. Britain does it too. It talks about stepping up, but its armed forces are still below target size. Its readiness has come under fresh criticism during the Iran crisis, and it's cutting aid to help fund defense because the country doesn't have enough room to do everything at once. That's not the behavior of a state overflowing with power. It's the behavior of a state making trade-offs under pressure. And Russia is the reminder that even apparent strength can mislead. Yes, military-related industrial output has surged, but war production is not the same as a healthy, adaptable economy. A country can still churn out weapons while narrowing its future and shrinking its border influence. In the end, power still rests on very old, very unfashionable things: productive economies, functioning states, military depth, industrial resilience, energy security, technological advantage, and assets other countries genuinely need. That last bit is especially important. Influence is not about being admired, it's about being necessary. A country matters when other states need access to its market, its money, its shipping, its protection, its intelligence, its technology, or its diplomatic cover. The fewer of those things it controls, the more it starts living off memory, the more it starts confusing ceremony with leverage. And that is when decline becomes psychologically dangerous because the country still feels important to itself long after others have started recalculating its value. This is why economics matters so much, even in an argument about influence. A state under pressure has fewer choices. It has to raid one arm of power to support another. It has less slack. It has less margin for error. Britain's own debate over defense and aid showed this clearly. The House of Commons Library knows that aid spending is being reduced from 0.5% of gross national income to 0.3% by 2027 to help fund higher defense spending. You can have whatever moral argument you like about that, but the strategic point is simpler. States with broad strength can sustain several instruments at once. States under strain start patching holes. Military numbers still matter too, even in an age of advanced weapons and precision systems. Britain's armed forces remain capable in important niches, but Commons Library figures show all three services below target size and total full-time personnel significantly below 2012 levels. Why does that matter? Because influence depends not only on quality, but on depth. Can you stay in the field? Can you absorb costs? Can you replenish? Can you sustain a burden over time? Other states care about that much more than they care about mythologies of national greatness. If you step back, the pattern across all these examples is remarkably consistent. Spain shows what happens when imperial wealth disguises fiscal weakness and overstretch. The Ottomans show what happens when administrative decay, military lag, and resistance to reform hollow out a great power over time. Suez shows how one crisis can expose that a country's rank has changed. The Soviet Union shows how military prestige can cover internal stagnation until the structure gives way. Europe today shows that wealth and institutions are not enough if strategic action is slow, fragmented, and dependent on others. Britain today shows how a country can retain diplomatic reach, alliance access, and major power symbols while still finding itself in a supportive role when the hardest decisions are taken elsewhere. And that is why countries so often misread their own decline. They're looking at the wrong indicators. They look at flags, summits, history, headlines, old titles, old privileges, and lingering deference. What they should be looking at is much simpler. Can they still make other powerful states stop and recalculate? Can they still act without asking permission? Can they still absorb costs without wobbling? Can they still offer something that nobody important can easily replace? If the answer starts turning away from yes to maybe, and from maybe to no, then decline is already underway, whether the speeches have caught up or not. So how do countries lose influence? They lose it when they stop being able to shape events and start mistaking commentary for power. They lose it when other states no longer need them enough to care. They lose it when prestige outlives leverage. They lose it when the symbols remain, but the room no longer bends around them. And once that happens, the only question left is how long it takes them to admit it.